Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for watching this video. It's a little weird that we're still presenting this over Zoom and whatnot. It's great because minimizes travel, gives some other folks the possibility of getting to getting to see some talks that maybe you wouldn't be able to. But at the same time, I really personally can't wait to be able to travel to conferences, go to the hallway track, and see everybody. But for now, that's what we have, and I'm very happy to be here sharing with you a little bit of some of the challenges I've been dealing with in my current position. So my name is Phil. I've given talks at a few different QCons and other conferences about various topics, but to be honest, mostly microservices. That's what I've been working with. That's what I've been kind of around in terms of community, technology, process, everything for the better part of the last 10 years. And when thinking about microservices, there's different stages of growth and understanding as an industry or what we've been. And I think probably now we're kind of the late stage microservices. We're looking at things that we look at the consequences of our actions. We're looking at the consequences of the decisions we made 10, 5, whatever many years ago, and how to evolve all these different pieces of technology and understanding to something more sustainable. And this is interesting to me in particular because historically, like I said, I've been in the microservices scene for quite a while. I was lucky enough to work on some of the pioneers in this space, being ThoughtWorks, SoundCloud, DigitalOcean, many others. And a lot of what my experience has been so far has been a little bit being there for the pre-game or the party, like just before things start heating up. Either as a consultant, I would come and help clients and figure out that actually the best way was to split big services into smaller ones, or growing a company like SoundCloud, DigitalOcean, and a few others in terms of, hey, we're growing a lot, our business is growing in interesting ways. We need to adopt an architecture that allows for us to grow the way we need to. And this often has to do with a little bit of hyperscale, growing like crazy, hiring too many people. And one thing I've learned going through this process a few times is that the most important thing you can do, like really the basics, is that first you really should think about the whole situation as you step into a more kind of distributed architecture style as a city planner, not a bricklayer. Now, if this was a in-person conference, this is a moment I'll be staring at y'all and trying to figure out who recognizes the image or not. This is from SimCity 2000. Actually, this might be SimCity, the original SimCity. Now I'm not sure myself. But basically, if you haven't played SimCity ever, what you do is you manage a city, as the name kind of says, the city simulator, but you don't manage any specific building. So this is a screenshot of the game, like a little animated thing. And you have no control over any of these particular buildings, cars, what have you. Well, all you can do is to say, hey, this is a residential area. There's a fire station here. There's a police station over there. There's a park here. You cannot build this way. A road goes this from A to B, but you don't have control over what gets built or what kind of motivation people have to go about exploring the city. You just frame the problem and let people go. And this is a lot of what I have experienced building a company based on microservices or product engineering, specifically a product engineering organization from microservices, building from the ground up. The thing to me is really to think about the whole problem. As a city planner, not a bricklayer, you really need to think about how you define your whole city, which eventually is your company. And another kind of image metaphor analogy I like to use is a little bit like procedural content generation. It's something that I find fascinating. Basically, is the procedural code generation or content generation is a technique by which you feed the computer with some constraints, some logic, some rules, and an algorithm and a random number generator, and just let it go. And then it produces like maybe dungeons for your RPG game, maybe there's levels for your first-person shooter or whatever it is. With the idea that a person wouldn't have to like explicitly draw levels for a game or what have you. The computer can generate that based on these rules that you've created. And to me, this is so similar to what happens when you were starting a company, starting the ground up, or maybe growing a company using microservices, what you need to do is you need to define a set of constraints to define like the boundaries of the problem and let people go. Because you're hiring thousands, or not thousands, you hire like dozens of people every month or every year, month, whatever you have here. And you will absolutely not be able to control what these people are going to do. These people are going to go, you hire them for their actual ability to build wonderful things, but you really need these things to talk to each other, to kind of have some level of governance so that the whole situation is manageable. But ultimately, you're not controlling each specific piece. This is extremely important. It's very hard as somebody who with a technical background, somebody who's used to write code, to understand that no, you don't own it anymore, but that's how you do. You just like you define the rules and you let the organization go. That's sometimes it's called enterprise architecture, although there's different flavors, but that's how I say it. And the interesting thing that I was talking about, how this in procedural generation for content, you let the computer randomness go about it. And obviously, when we're talking about microservices, you let your organization's randomness, which exists. Just like people come, people go, different projects are staffed or killed. These things come and go. And what you need to do is to define the rules that will let the company generate the content here being the microservices or whatever have you. So that's kind of how I've been, I would say, successful running companies based on these kind of highly distributed architectures we call microservices. And then more recently, I've been facing a new challenge. So I work for this company called BigPay, and I don't blame you if you don't know what BigPay is. BigPay is the largest wallet, the digital wallet in Latin America. We do payments, peer-to-peer payments, kind of merchant payments, everything around finance, both for consumers and enterprises. It's like a lot of products, basically what we call it usually a super app. Focused in Brazil. I'm originally from Brazil. I live in New York right now. But if you're Brazilian, you for sure know the app and what it does, because that's what everybody down there does. I use for payments and various other things. A very famous brand within this demographic. But the most important thing for this talk is not so much what BigPay does. You can think of it just like a payments application, a little bit of Cash App and Square here in the US, Venmo are brands that are similar to what we do down in Brazil. But basically, the important thing here is how BigPay grew. And I'm used to kind of wild growth and what we generally call hypergrowth. But this is a whole new level, at least to me. This is a chart of our team size. We started with a few people, the small offices often do. And after, not quickly, because these people working on this app for a very long time, like 6-7 years, but then eventually market conditions, funding, everything comes together, and we need to scale this business up. We go from one product to over 30, and quickly move from 50 people in engineering to about 2,000 now. We are, I believe, 3,500 people right now across the whole business. It's like the business side, support, everything. But we're about 2,000 engineers or people who work in engineering capacities, managers, data scientists, all that kind of stuff. And this is wild. And to me, it's a good representation of the challenges we have right now, which is really like, okay, so we've scaled so much. How can we, over such a quick period of time, we had to make a lot of decisions. We had to go about things in a way that allowed for us to scale like that. And the decisions we had to make as we're growing, the decisions we had to make during this process are not necessarily the best decisions for the rest of the company, for the next phase of the company or the current phase of the company, which is a little bit of the reason I and a few other people were hired and put into this place. It's like, okay, we need folks to look at what we have and kind of put us into back on track to keep growing as we're doing, but in a more sustainable way. And this is an interesting challenge. And the way I see this is really that for the first time, I'm kind of invited to the after party. Because, I've been playing this startup game for a little while. You often, more often than not, are there for the beginning, the company succeeds or not, maybe makes money, maybe doesn't make money. There's a lot of different things, and your interests change as well. Maybe after a few years, you're just like, okay, I've done what I had to do here and move on to a different thing. But this time, my team and I are facing the challenge of a highly successful company that grew extremely quickly. And now we need to make sure that we keep executing at a pace that allows for us to keep playing the game in the financial marketplace and the financial business that we are at, which is highly competitive. There's old school banks, there's new banks popping up every day, there's new apps, there's regulation, there's all sort of different things. So we really need to make sure that we are on the right track when it comes to our experimentation, our product quality, all this kind of stuff. And it's important for me as also to give you all a disclaimer. This is all work in progress. I was very happy when I was invited to give this talk to you all today, but I was very clear as well to the hiring, to the committee chair that, I've been at BigPay since January. So it's my 3.5 month mark now. I think I know most people's names, but I'm happy to share today a few of the things that we've been doing, that we started doing. And if you kind of catch up with me in about a year, I will probably update you on what of this maybe have changed, maybe didn't work out so well, what we keep investing on, what other things we found out that work or not work in this scenario. But because there's so much to talk about, there's so many areas, and from organizations, technology to architecture to many things, I want to focus on like three pieces of advice that I've been giving people in similar situations. And also when I hire, I'm kind of hiring a lot of more senior leaders to help me join the team and build a lot of the organization. This is the kind of the advice I've been giving them in coming to BigPay, what I think is the right thing to do, joining during the after party. So first one, the first thing I think is the most important is stop the bleed. A lot has happened in this company and possibly in your company. There's a lot of different teams, projects, things going up. And at any given time, there's going to be, in a company with 2,000 people, at any given time, there's going to be 10 new projects popping up. There's going to be 10 new systems popping up. There's things that you possibly can't know about that are being done right now that are going to impact your architecture, your technology, your strategy really quickly in the future. So what I think the most important thing to do as a leader company, being a senior engineer, engineer manager, director, CTO, whatever are you, like really the first thing you should focus on is to stop the bleed. Make sure that we're not making the problem worse every day. Just like whatever new systems, whatever new things pop up should not be taking a step back. They should move you forward. And the first thing, or one of the things that you need to do around this, is to make explicit the rules that you want to follow, even if they're not strictly enforced. The last part is very important, but the first part too, like make explicit the rules, is something that even when you're growing with microservices, when you're growing a more organized way, when they're from the beginning, again, it's kind of the procedural code generation we're talking about, I believe you need to do. You need to make sure that the constraints you want to follow are very explicit and encourage people to follow them. Now, what are these kind of constraints? For example, you could decide that, hey, we use RESTful designs for applications here. We use HTTP and all the kind of niceties around that. Or no, actually, we use gRPC and don't want to see any HTTP endpoint ever. All these kind of decisions that you need to make around observability, telemetry, how things talk to each other, how things are deployed. Those are the kind of rules I'm talking about here. Make sure that you have them explicit. Either if you're growing with microservices or if you're kind of refactoring an existing microservices setup, you really need to make sure that these are clear. But that's one difference between growing and kind of refactoring that I found. When you're growing with microservices, it's very easy for you to nip in the bud when things are going awry. So if I decide that my service will use Thrift instead of gRPC, everything else using gRPC, it's a lot easier as you're growing to identify that and say, hey, no, you cannot do that. This is not what we do here. This is not what we're going to do here. Because you only have maybe a few services, everybody knows everybody else, the company is still growing. When you're refactoring the organization, it's a little harder to enforce things so strictly, because maybe, there's a new service that's going to be produced and it's going to use Thrift instead of gRPC. You've decided to use gRPC, they're going to use Thrift. You could go there and say, hey man, no, sorry, you cannot do this. It is not allowed. And maybe that will be okay. But there's so much entropy. Maybe you're talking about an organization with 100 engineers that have always used Thrift on that side. So your decisions are between migrating everything that exists to use gRPC or what have you, or allowing just one case to use Thrift, and then there's another case more, and there's another case, and there's another case. And it's an interesting balance between these things. But in my experience, at first, you shouldn't really focus too much on trying to strictly enforce the rules that you've set for organization. What you should focus on instead is to promote the things you want. So it's fine that, maybe some people are going to use different RPC styles, but you really should make sure that whoever decides to use the flavor that you have picked, right, let's say in this case gRPC, have a very seamless experience, which often means that you will have some kind of platform team, tooling team focused on make sure that the tools used in the golden path, on the paved way, they are the best tools. They're better than the tools that people can use elsewhere. And there's a few different kind of sets of rules you can adopt on this. There's various different flavors. My recommendation would definitely be to at least follow some of what we call the prerequisites for microservices. Make sure these things are well established as rules in your organization. This is a list that I've compiled based on a list originally Martin Fowler had. We call it Calçado's microservices prerequisites. I think this is the basic you need to do microservices well at scale. So if you find yourself in a situation like this, make sure that you have an answer to at least each one of these topics that you want to promote and defend and want your people to use. So similar to this, in this same vein, I would say that make the work visible is very important. When you have a very big organization and have a lot of different services, hundreds of services, hundreds of people, maybe hundreds of teams, there's a lot happening that's not, it's never going to hit you until, something's in production, or it's when it's generally way too late. And one thing I really like is to foster or to more and more promote a culture of people share ideas in different ways, and they share what they've been thinking about and the design of their systems as widely as possible. There's a few different ways to go about this, but one way that I definitely recommend, and it could be a whole talk in itself, is a structured RFC process. This is one that I particularly like. It's one I've been using for almost a decade now, with a lot of iteration. Basically, the idea here is that you ask people to write in a document with a specific format that drives to some kind of interactions or thinking that I consider to be good. And you have people commenting on that. And there's like different logistic ways. And the interesting thing to me, or a few of the interesting things, is that first, this is not a decision-making process. This is a knowledge-sharing process. What does that mean? Is that the person writing the RFC is accountable for the system being proposed, okay? So that person needs to be able to make decisions. You do not want to put anyone in a position where they are accountable for something, but they don't have autonomy over it. Somebody else makes the decision, but if things break in the middle of the night, I'm the one responsible for that. That's the worst of all worlds. And I really, really would like to avoid that as much as possible. So this process, there's a link down there. You can read a little bit more about this, but it's really about writing down what you're thinking, getting input from people all over the company. And that's why it's really important to have a mailing list, a Slack channel, whatever forum your organization prefer, to publicize this idea, give it a time frame, like, hey, we have 1 week to comment on this idea, and know that the decision is still with the person. The decision still needs to be with whoever is accountable for that. But this person should receive feedback from the whole organization and act accordingly on this. And there's a few interesting things like expiry date, review process, and things like that. Definitely recommend you look at this process. But it doesn't matter if you use this process or not. What matters to me is that you have some kind of way so that people working on different systems, different services across the company are broadcasting that to others to get input, which is very important, especially because talent disparity often occurs, but also to share knowledge so that next time I need something, it's like, hey, I remember that 2 weeks ago, somebody was talking about a system that uses Kafka, and I want to use Kafka now on my system. Maybe I should read that RFC, talk to that person. One last bit on this is that I find this to be extremely important in a more distributed world like we are, like everybody's remote, where it's not people don't go for beers together or for coffee or so often, where have the serendipity of exchanging information. So there's a way to force information to be shared in a way that even if you don't immediately need or care about that, it stays in the back of your head, and you can like quickly search your email or Slack or what have you to find out information about something that was built a while ago. All right, so this is the first one. The second, I would say, is don't miss the forest for the trees. This is extremely important, again, when you're growing an organization based on microservices. But I think it's even worse, or more important, when you're joining a company that already has adopted that at a large scale. Because the first thing you want to do as an engineer is to go like, okay, give me access to GitHub. I want to read the code of everything. It's just not natural instinct, right? Like that's how we used to do things before these highly distributed applications was so prevalent. You would spend some time reading through at least the most important parts of the code of any system that you've inherited. In my experience, this doesn't work so well with microservices because it's very distributed, and the value of looking inside each box is not as big as you might find. It's a lot more interesting to look at the whole system. So the forest here, not the trees. It's an interesting analogy, and sometimes it breaks in different and funny ways, but basically that's the main idea behind that really we should be looking at the whole ecosystem, the trees themselves, and not the forest as much. And around this thing, there's always a few exceptions. So the first one I want to acknowledge is that, sure, forest for the trees, but you really need to make sure that you identify and fix any of the hot potatoes immediately. And what I mean by hot potatoes are those systems that clearly are causing trouble. Those systems that clearly breaking in production or are not performing very well, are burning too much money, which is a common issue across microservices, or what have you. Like these systems that require attention, yes, do look at those systems immediately. Don't waste any time. But only those that are really worth the time, like something that's critical, something that's on fire all the time, and it's causing a lot of problem. Because you should really avoid getting distracted with each individual system. Going back a little bit to our SimCity analogy, you really should start thinking about this as a city. Like basically you inherited this township or this kind of community of people, and it grew organically, right? So like any organic community, or if you think of a market, if you just people start building a market from scratch, there's not going to be a lot of organization. You're probably going to have the person who sells raw fish next to the person who sells, some toxic cleaning product. It's probably not a good idea. So you need really to step in and look at, okay, how can I have all these things? It's a vibrant market. It's a vibrant marketplace of ideas, of projects, of different things. How can I help these folks organize the work they're doing or structure this community in a way that makes sense? And there's, I found a few things in my career that I think make good sense in this scenario. One of them is what I call the clay to rocks model. It's a layering model, and I have a good friend who keeps accusing me even of every time I give a talk, I need to talk about layers, and that's kind of true. So layers are very powerful idea in software engineering and in many other things in life, but software engineering especially, where you pile your software in a way where there's, again, layers, groupings of systems with similar properties that you want to grab together and think of them as one thing. The clay to rocks model, there's a lot more detail in the links that the slide deck that you have access to. But the idea is that you have systems that are clay, and these systems are high churn with a small blast radius. So basically, systems are more malleable that you can change all the time. They will change all the time. These tend to be close to the use case. These tend to be closer to the user. So maybe that's the one feature your product team wants to experiment with. Nobody knows it's going to be successful or not. So there's no point in wasting 2 years building the perfect version of this if you don't even know if it's going to be successful. Just wire some stuff together, put it out, see if it sticks. If we evolve after that, like we kind of bake the clay, if you will. But don't spend too much time thinking about the quality of the system. That's where lead time and cycle time even is much more so much more valuable than anything else. And you have other systems that are kind of rocks. Excuse me. And by this, I mean that they are lower on the layering scheme, and they enable almost every other feature in the system. This will be kind of the system that provides you information about authentication or your user database, or maybe in our case, for example, performs financial transactions. If you want to move money from account A to account B, there's 1 million reasons why we could do this. Maybe I want to move money from my savings account to my checking account. Maybe you want to move money from your account to my account to pay me for the pizza we just had, or whatever it is. There's 1 million different use cases, but there should be one system that has a basic interfaces like from account to account, amount of money, maybe reason, boom, send. So this is how these ROC systems work. And they need to be super stable because, again, they empower so many different use cases. They often are the heart of the operation. If they are out, the whole company is out, but there's only so many of them. Usually you have a lot more of these clay systems than the ROC systems, and they have different characteristics. So like drawing the picture a little bit, this is from the original article I wrote about this layering scheme when I was working at meetup.com. And it's like, that's the example we've been using here, where there's various different systems or services within meetup.com. You have information about groups, information about membership, information about users, information about events, and all this kind of stuff. And then as you go up the stack, this is the bottom, if you go up the stack, you have a lot more specialized things. You have the user profile service that provides you with data about how that's displayed on your screen, on your app or browser when you go to meetup.com to check out who a user's profile. Like my profile would have some information coming from that. And if you look at this situation, you can kind of specify which of these systems are more like clay and more like rocks. The systems that are clay, and coming from this particular experience at Meetup, with the systems that we always exploring, changing, churning, experimenting with, our user profile page used to change every week because some product person, some designer person, some marketing person will have an idea or wanted to promote something else. Maybe they move things around, maybe they add more data, remove data from that particular user experience, but the membership, the actual membership service, the group service, the user service did not change at all. It's just how the data provided by the services was being used. And when you're talking about coming from a situation where you inherit a lot of services such as this, and you need to put them into shape, this is a little bit of what happened. You need to start figuring out what are the systems that need to be more stable, and what are the systems that don't have to be so stable. And invest a lot of time, effort, energy, maybe drop your best people to make sure that your ROC service, like the ones that are really important to your normal operation, are working to the level that you need them to work. These are fundamental systems, they cannot go out. So you probably will be optimizing for stability and performance, not so much for developer productivity and other things. Maybe to even like the code review constraints for these systems are more specific or more stringent than some for others. Meanwhile, identifying the clay systems allow you not to worry too much about that. So when you have thousands of engineers working on thousands of things, you really don't have only so much headspace to worry about each specific thing. So in this situation, building a map like this would allow you to make sure that you prioritize putting your attention and your best people on the rocks layer, and then figuring out, and then, deprioritizing the amount of effort you need to put on the clay layer for now, and then maybe on a case-by-case basis. This is an incredibly helpful model in many different ways, but I found it invaluable in this particular situation where we're refactoring an existing architecture. And still within layering, there's another model I like that's also part of the same article, and kind of comes from the same experience, which is the edge internal external. It's a very kind of basic idea. There's nothing new here, but basically the idea is that you need to flag which of your services are part of the edge. And what I mean by part of the edge means the services that are exposed to the outside world, services that have received inbound connections from outside. Probably is the public internet. Probably, you know, the way things work these days, it's very likely that even if there's only a subset of people who can access your service, you still expose it to the internet and use other security things to make sure they're only accessible to the right people. But it could be also that it's only accessible from your partners or in some kind of network that you might own. This is really edge, means that external people who are not external systems that you don't have control over access this thing. And there's a few different laser services, sometimes like API gateways, BFFs, what have you, kind of play a good role here. But I also put into this all the supporting systems for that. So authentication, authorization, rate limiting, throttling, all these kind of things kind of belong on this layer. And there's specific things that you want or you don't want in systems on this layer. The other one, which is the most common, commonly used, where most of the vast majority of our systems are going to run, it's the internal layer. So systems that are only used inside of VPN. And I'm using VPN here loosely because it's a, I don't know, maybe call it DMZ, I don't know. But the idea here is this is really the systems that you develop and talk to each other. So upstream and downstream systems within your network. There's obviously it's 2022. The system should talk via HTTPS, TLS of some sorts. They should have security inside the network. There's almost no reason not to have security inside the network, even if it's your own network. Plain HTTP traffic is a big no-no for 5-6 years now. But still, there are things that you are willing to accept more inside this network than inbound communication coming from the outside. And then, which is kind of a weird overlap, but if you structure them well, ends up in its own layer, it's external services in the sense that services that may call to other services or systems that may call to services outside of VPN. Now, it's interesting because you say, well, but isn't that just an internal service that maybe makes a call to the world outside the VPN? Yes, but at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that a well-structured system, probably, or a well-structured architecture of services wouldn't allow any service to just make random calls out to outside your VPN. Again, VPN here being used very loosely, mostly like your internal systems. I would really encourage you all to make sure that the systems that you own that make external calls, the gateways to something else, maybe it's a push notification system, maybe it's a third-party service that you use or whatever it is, that they are isolated and you take in. Basically, they're the only pieces that can actually make calls to the outside world. Everything else is basically forbidden from making these calls. You have a few systems that can make calls to the outside world. And then if you get this lens, you inherit any structure like this. You have a lot of different services up and down. They kind of look the same because, again, we're thinking forest, not tree. So I'm not even going to care which of these systems does what. But you start identifying that some of these systems belong to what we're calling the edge layer. Some of others are calling we're calling the internal layer and the external layer. And that's when things got a little more interesting because systems that belong to the edge layer, you definitely need to, similar to the rock systems we're talking about, and there's an overlap between this pattern and the other kind of this, there's an interesting interplay. But the edge layer, I would say, is mostly rock systems, as we were talking just before, in the sense that some of them are going to have high churn. For example, API gateway, you probably come in and go in with new endpoints, but it's interesting ways to make sure that this is not too much of a problem. But your authentication system, your authorization system, your rate limiting system, those things need to just work. If you're changing your authorization system every week or every iteration or every month, there's something wrong. You really need to get it going, either use a third-party service or you build your own. You get it going once and you kind of barely touch it, except like, some security patch or some small evolution here and there. Changing systems in the edge layer should be a big deal. And if you have a company that has 2,000 people or if you have enough people in your platform and infrastructure organizations, I strongly recommend that you have a team fully dedicated just to the edge layer. It doesn't need to be a big team, but those folks should be looking a lot at your network infrastructure. You're probably talking about CDN as well and various other things. Then immediately below, we have the internal layer where requests hitting this layer have already been sanitized in different ways. Again, that doesn't mean that we can drop all security measures and use plain text HTTP or anything like that. But we definitely a little more secure in this layer. And that's, this is where high churn happens. Where systems come, systems go. The tooling you have for deployment and support, monitoring, telemetry should be optimized for this layer, because the vast majority of your systems are going to be here. And then you have the external layer, which is like these systems that make calls to systems outside. These I do recommend that you completely isolate and acknowledge systems that are allowed to make calls to external systems or to external services. A few different reasons. The main one I would claim is if a service does not belong to the external layer, they should not have access to the public internet. If they try to make a call to the public internet, they should just be blocked. And there's a lot of interesting things that would be avoided by this. I guess the Log4j bug more recently is one case where this would be mitigated by having such role in most systems, because even if you receive something that randomly makes your system contact the outside world, they wouldn't be allowed to, because they are not part of the external layer, so they should be forbidden. And even thinking about these layers in different ways, there's different things you can do in your tooling. Maybe use manifest files, maybe use different things to explicitly acknowledge the layer each system belongs, so that your infrastructure tooling, your security tooling, and many other things can automatically detect if some of the systems are not behaving the way they should. So this is like the two layering things, thinking about, still very much on the city planner mindset. But as somebody who, again, just joined this role three and a half months ago, I would say the most important thing to me is don't panic. It's crazy when you join a company, there's like thousands of people working on thousands of things, and you're like, oh shit, I don't even know what's going on. It can be very overwhelming. There's a whole different talk here around how to build your support systems, how to make sure that you as a manager, as a leader, feel empowered and have the right tool, the right team, the right mindset to tackle this problem. But thinking a little bit more on the technical side, don't panic, to me, has a few things, not a lot of them. The most important really is don't try to boil the ocean. Now, this is another test for if folks in this talk are as old as me or younger. This is the moment I would ask people to raise their hand if they would recognize this image. I am very curious who wouldn't. But this is the Windows defrag, something that whoever grew up was probably whoever was born in the 80s or grew up very close to computers in the 90s are very familiar with. The idea here is that for various different reasons, Windows had file systems, I think it was the FAT family of file systems, who would gradually fragment. So they would have one thing that you think of a file, but it actually be distributed all over your hard drive. You would have those spinning hard drives. They were really slow. And eventually, because you want to access one file, it was spread across multiple different sectors in that disk. Everything was, your computer would get extremely slow, and you had to run this tool that came with the system to defrag. So basically to regroup things slowly. And this is an animation that actually would it would display to you while I was doing the job. I don't know how accurate that was, but I always found this fascinating. Showing how it was kind of grouping the sectors together and finding bad sectors and things like this. And one of the reasons I like this, and I use this image all the time, is because this is how I see my job for a very long time now, not just this particular job. It's really like I'm the Windows defrag manager. I'm not here to magically solve all problems at once. My role as the leader of an organization going through this transformation is to gradually defrag sector by sector, file by file, whatever it is, make sure that maybe your company's a mess today, that's fine. Maybe your company's a mess tomorrow, it's fine. But as long as the mess you have tomorrow has less entropy than what you had yesterday or what you had today, you're in a good, you're going in the right direction. You're doing well, don't panic, things are gonna be okay. And because I keep saying that management is one of the most not most lonely professions I know, like leadership can be really drain on people. He's just a picture of a dog. That happens to be my dog. He needs more Instagram followers, so I've been trying to kind of push them in any work that I'm doing right now to keep you happy. But the main idea I have, or the main thing I want to share with you all now is you really need to think of this problem in a more strategic way. Take steps back. Don't think as an engineer. Like I, as you might see by my bookshelf right here, am a big nerd. I love programming languages. I love coding. But in a role like this, in the role like I am at right now, this is not my job. My job is to look at the whole ecosystem as it's the city. I'm really thinking about it as like a city planner, not a bricklayer, not somebody who's building one building. I'm building the whole organization, and there's different ways to go about this. So thank you very much. I hope that next time we're able to meet in person, but I guess we go for Q&A now. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for this really, really interesting presentation. People, feel free to type your questions in the chat. Otherwise, I will make a personal interview and take all the Phil's time to support myself. And my first question would be: imagine, because especially because I'm interested that we just joined like 3 months on the BigPay, and the practice that you explained to drive the hyper growth of the company are really interesting. But I'm looking for more in a practice perspective. Imagine that I'm just joining a company and the team not behave well on some of the points. For instance, don't have a culture of write design docs, document or RFCs to document the decisions. What you advise to me to start on the stream without being too pushy, trying to put the same frame of my company? And besides that, because comparing this, try to not be too pushy, but actually to also deliver results. Because we have the window to impress people and to show what someone to hire you, pay you to go to do at the company. How you balance between changing the direction of a team that you just joined and adapting to, for the team's culture?
That's a good question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, I think this is a little bit of the mindset that I was trying to talk about when I mentioned the defrag component. I have a standing window every day for 1 hour, like office hours, where I talk to random people to the organization. Oftentimes, I get new hires coming, and that's a question I get a lot. It's like, hey, I'm new here. It's a really big organization. My team, has practices that may not be the practice I think are the best one. What should I do? And my recommendation in that case is really to think about this that way. I look, there's as any big company, there are initiatives in how to improve, standardize, change the whole thing. Like again, the defrag kind of mindset. But you really need to focus on a company this big. You really need to think locally and think globally, act locally. Like, what are the things that you can do to improve your team? You're not going to go from 3 to 10, but how we can go from 3 to 4 and talk to other people. Now, this is one thing that's been really challenging to me, to be honest, because I started my work remote. I'm actually going to go to our headquarters for the first time in a few weeks. And I'm so used to having the buzz and the marketplace of ideas happening there, where you get to know what other people are doing just by bumping into them. We've been trying more and more to have more social channels where people can exchange ideas, what different teams are doing. But I think in this case, the most important thing really is to focus on improving your team and then sharing those ideas, and obviously, stealing ideas from other teams. And the one thing that I am really worried about in a company this big, and even a company smaller, right? If you talk about 500 people, 200 people, is don't try to boil the ocean again. Don't try to solve the process for the whole company. Solve for your team, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then let's talk as a collective of engineers. What are the things that we can extract and make a process that works for more people? I think really it's really important to, like you're saying, also to deliver within that one team. And if with thousands of people, if you try to work out what works for everyone, you're never going to do anything. So think globally, but act locally is kind of the main motto there, I think.
And a second, more practical question: if I'm trying to implement an incident response system with people on a call in my company, what would be your advice to start this process?
That's a good one. First one is don't reinvent the wheel. There's 35 new processes. I think PagerDuty has a really comprehensive guide on that. And even if you don't use PagerDuty, we don't use PagerDuty at BigPay at the moment. The guide is great. I really, really appreciate it. That I would say with a lot of these processes, try to implement as is and iterate over time. But do not try to create a very sophisticated kind of thing that will take forever and it will require a full team just to maintain the process, especially for smaller. There's only a few things you need in the incident management process. It's like, communications and incident commander and things like that. Everything else is nice, but not necessary. So I'd say stick to a model that's known to work. Again, my recommendation is the PagerDuty model, but I know there's others. I think the people behind Fire Hydrant also have a different model that probably works better with their tool, but I guess can be generalized as well.
Thank you. A question from Dave is, when refactoring systems at wide level, do you have any tips to incentivize developers to stop using old API services, code, etc. you are trying to get rid of?
Make them super slow. Just kidding. Although this kind of works.
Yeah, works.
Yeah, it's what I have. This is, I think a lot of it has to do with, managing the life cycle of an API is always complicated. My main recommendation would be to actually, it might be a little late, but to think about, if from the beginning, minimize the number of dependencies to things that are not published interfaces. So we have this concept that I really like. Martin Fowler wrote an article many years ago between public and published interfaces, in the sense that a public interface is like a public method in a programming language. You can call it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should call it. Maybe you're calling a private API, it just happens to be public. And a published interface is something that's well supported, well documented, and all this kind of stuff. My main recommendation this way is to make sure that you have a good distinction between public and published interfaces. And whatever you call published interfaces, you really support them well. Because, as I'm a leader now, I can go and, hit people on the head with order and say, you need to move from A to B in 5 months. But that's kind of, not only is not a great working experience for people, but there's other priorities, there's compromises people need to make. In my own experience, the best way to drive wide refactoring around an organization, or wide change, is to make sure that whatever you want them to do is much easier, a much better experience, much better supported than the bad way. The bad way can rot and go bad. Obviously, you need to maintain some level of support, but make sure that the new way is awesome. And then in my experience, you gradually see, especially the same newcomers we were talking about just in the previous question, they will want to use this new stuff. They will not want to use the old ways of doing things. And you might need a project or two to kind of migrate from old to new. But I think the whole thing about stop the bleed is very important. So by providing a better alternative that's better to them, not just to the teams providing the API, you end up in a better state, in a better situation that way.
Yep. And two side questions for the hypergrowth factor is, the first one is how you scale as BigPay scale from to thousands of developers, preserving the culture of the company. And second, on this hot market, how do you actually find people to scale in this future growth?
That's a very interesting question. The first one, I can tell you what we've done at BigPay. Before I joined that, we did not preserve the culture at all. If you look at BigPay right now, it still is very much divided in, I won't say 8 different business units or groups. They have different cultures. Some come from more of a banking/fintech background. Some come from more kind of startup-y, consumer-driven company. And what we're trying now is to find what works for the company as a whole. But then again, I don't think that we can apply the same rule to somebody who's building our social graph or messaging system. They shouldn't necessarily have the same ways and the same culture. Somebody who's been a deep banking system that integrates with bigger banks that move very slowly. We need to have some baseline, but each team needs to be a little bit of autonomy to decide what works best for them. I think the most important thing, looking at the big picture, is really thinking about the interfaces between these teams, like this human interfaces, the protocols. What are the things, even from iteration planning, if I need something on our backlog, how can I get there? Do I have to talk to people? Is that a Jira ticket I open? How does that work? All the way to use the same RPC protocol, and our APIs look the same. But it's in a company that's doing a lot of many different things, the things that are really different, you really need to allow for a little bit of different cultural differences amongst various teams. The one thing that I would say, and that connects to your first question, to your second question, is that I definitely recommend that you have one funnel for hiring. I think this is something that larger companies, Google, Facebook, how those do well, and that there's one funnel for people coming in. Because in a company like this, a team that exists tomorrow or a whole division might not exist in the next month. Or it might be an experiment. And you really don't want to get to a situation where you hyper specialized hiring for one particular team, and you feel like you can't move these people. This applies to managers and engineers very much. On the hiring side, it's an interesting situation. Like everybody else, hiring like crazy. I think a lot of my mindset comes from my experience when I was actually working in Europe for SoundCloud, where remote working wasn't really a thing. This was 2010 to 2015, and what we had to do was to attract people from Silicon Valley. Really, people have grew companies the way we were growing SoundCloud before, and make them move to Berlin, make less money because you can make a lot more money in the US, more equity, more everything. Some people would love to move to Berlin because they like the lifestyle. Some people would not. So how can we attract these people there? And making sure that the culture inside the company and the work we were doing was super interesting was a fundamental thing in all that. So if you look at the published material we had between 2011 and 15 at SoundCloud, a lot of it was us making sure that people all over the world knew that we were doing cool stuff. So you could go for Google and work on YouTube's credit card form for 8 months, like a famous Hacker News thread from the other day, or you can come to work for us and build the whole ad targeting system that we built from scratch. So I think finding what your competitive advantage is fundamental that way. Obviously, you need to have equal pay and allow for various other things, but there is you really need to find a competitive advantage, which is, to be completely honest, is something we're still finding out at BigPay. Finding out what's the sweet spot at a company this big.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank everyone that's staying the track for the whole day. And Phil will be with us at a hangout session to have some more time. And thank you so much for coming, and see you all tomorrow at Geekon Plus. Thank you.
Thank you so much.